Okay, so with that, let's get into it. So, like I mentioned, this is the Patreon opening lab. We do this once a month where we answer questions from Patreon. A lot of good questions this month. And yeah, let me just get into the first one here from Joe B, who asked, in the Exchange-Caro, after 4 bishop d3, knight c6, c3, queen c7. Actually, you just put this on the board. I have my notes here. So Exchange-Caro is e takes d5. I actually like this setup for white. I played it in the e4 speedrun, and I generally recommend it to players of pretty much all levels. Takes bishop d3, knight c6, c3, queen c7 prevents us from playing bishop f4. Yeah, so this is kind of the idea for white in this system is to play bishop f4, and so this move is designed to carefully stop it. Normally black plays something like knight f6, and then white's idea is that we're playing bishop f4 because we're delaying knight f3. So if you go knight f3 here, then bishop g4, I think black develops pretty comfortably. So they started playing bishop f4 first, just to develop. Then the queen comes out to b3, and black has to kind of make a move here, right? Like if black plays e6, then the bishop is shut down. If black goes bishop g4, then queen b3, and there's some small theory here, but basically white is continuing to develop. Black can play like queen d7 here and e6. It's a pretty solid position. I like white's chances there. I like the structure that white gets. I like that you can use this e5 square. You can actually transpose into this position from the London system. I think this is one of the better structures that you can get out of the London, and so it's pretty solid for white. So because this line, I think, is at least a little bit pleasant, some Caro players started playing queen c7 here, which I did not really know too much about this move. But actually, our boy Evan Rosenberg did a opening lab, or an opening clinic, I should say, on the Caro-Kann. I think he touched a little bit on this position. So I'm asking him to do another Caro stream sometime soon, because I think people really enjoyed that one. And yeah, I looked into this a little bit. So the question asks, we can still try to play for bishop f4 with knight f3. Okay, but that's met with bishop g4. And then if we play knight e2 instead, then usually, yeah, black goes bishop g4 here, and then white plays f3, bishop d7, bishop f4. Now black plays e5, takes. We get this kind of position where we gave black this isolated queen pawn, but black is going to be able to kind of get some counterplay, and we weakened our dark squares in the long run. So yeah, like normally I would say this structure is nice against with the isolated queen pawn for white, but if we have to play f3 to get this, then that's like a big bonus for black. So I definitely agree with that. So it looks like white has several weaknesses on the dark squares due to f3, and bishop d6 is coming. And to break the pin on the knight, some comp as black is an IQP, but I don't know if that's a strength or a weakness here. Yeah, I would say it kind of balances it out as far as I understand. Any alternatives on how to play this as white? I really dislike the idea of playing f3 in these positions, but bishop g4 seems too strong otherwise. Yeah, so I looked into this one, and I think the way players are playing it now is that in this position, after queen c7, they're going h3. And this, I think, is now kind of self-explanatory upon seeing the previous lines, like white is just stopping bishop to g4. And the big difference here is that if black plays for like e5 anyway, now black is leaving themselves with an isolated queen pawn, but white hasn't really weakened their position. So this one I would actually say looks pretty nice for white. To me, it reminds me very much of the positions we get in the Tarrasch French, where black gets an isolated queen pawn as well. So I'll just put that position on the board just so we can kind of like quickly compare. But when black plays c5 in this position, then white takes on d5. If black takes with the pawn, a lot of times we get this kind of position where white ends up taking on c5, and then we get this structure where black has an isolated queen pawn, and white has, let's say, 3 on 3. Black has this one weakness. White has a very easy time of playing c3, knight d4, or knight b3, and then controlling the d4 square. And in general, I would say these positions are pleasant for white. Not like white has like a huge advantage, but small advantage. The pawn on d5 is weak, and it's a little bit easier for white to play. Although even today, I think players as black some will happily go into this position and try to hold it. But this has always been considered kind of a nice little plus for white. And so that position in the Exchange-Caro kind of reminds me a little bit, like the structure is pretty much the same. And I looked at some games here. There was one recent game where Rustam Kazimzanov, who is a very good theoretician, he worked for like Vichy for a while, and lately he's been one of like Fabi's seconds. So he played bishop b5 check in this position. And then after knight c6, both sides kind of developed normally. And then it's like very, very similar to that French position we were looking at. In fact, he played like rook e1, castles, bishop c2, knight d2. And it's like, yeah, just very, very similar to that Tarrasch French. And yeah, to me, this felt like a very pleasant version for white because h3 is not nearly a series of a weakness instead of f3. So this is one way to play it. I saw there, I think, some games with bishop c2 right away, which looks very similar, followed by knight f3. And to me, it feels like, yeah, white is just slightly better here, playing against this weakness. Black doesn't, I think, have like full compensation for this one, so I would probably be happy here as white. So that's one way black tries to play these positions, is that if they play for e5, then they kind of leave themselves with this weakness. I think we should be okay here, given that we're playing for a small advantage. The other way black can play these positions is by playing some form of g6 and putting the bishop on g7. And just to kind of make things clear, black doesn't really want to go e6 in these positions because it then just kind of shuts down the light squared bishop, and I think white is doing pretty well. So g6, and I noticed a lot of players play queen c2 here, and I imagine this move, the point of this one is to stop bishop f5. Because I've noticed a lot of Caro players like to go bishop f5 in these kinds of positions and offer this trade where they get the open g file and they get good control over the e4 square. It's really hard for me to evaluate these positions, but I can understand why white would want to just avoid it in the first place. And now black's light square bishop doesn't really have any good squares to develop to. So I saw a nice blitz game actually between Aronian and Artemiev. And actually I noticed Aronian had this position twice. He played it against Pragnananda a couple of years ago. And then he played it in blitz against Artemiev earlier this year. So he seems to believe in this line for whites. And I'll just show like a couple moves, like he castled, he played rook e1 here. And then against both players, he went bishop e3 and then knight d2. And then this was his kind of setup. Now, I actually think blitz games at the high level are totally useful because a lot of times they're still playing their quote unquote prep, but they're still showing ideas that could be interesting. And if someone gets in trouble quickly, it could be very instructive. Like, oh, like, how does a strong player end up worse? You know, it must be interesting variation. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested more in this line, to kind of look up those games, Aronian Artemiev, Aronian versus Pragnananda, and see how he handled these positions, because he definitely ended up very pleasantly better as white. Okay, Joe, hopefully that answers that question. Basically, you play h3 and then you stop bishop g4. And if black doesn't want an IQP, they have to allow knight f3, queen c2. And that looks like a very pleasant setup for me. So hopefully that is suitable for you as well. Let's go to the next question, which is from Z-Webs Toss. And Z-Webs is asking, or is it Z-Web ZZ Toss? Z-Web is asking, what move order or opening is most annoying for one c4 players to face? I usually play Slav versus one d4, but if they play one c4, one c6, they always happily play two e4. Yeah, interesting question. Okay, so against the English, so we're kind of asking, like, what should black do here? If c6, you don't really want to play a Caro-Kann after e4, which is what we end up getting here. Black typically plays d5, and then white can either play a Panov attack or a, I don't know what this is called exactly, but some players, they just take twice. Oh, accelerated Panov, thank you, chess.com. And then white kind of plays these positions. So we'll talk about these a little bit because I actually think they're very playable for black. But let's kind of think about black's other options here. Now, in terms of what opening is most annoying for c4 players to face, that's kind of hard to answer. I mean, they're definitely expecting you to play something like e5 or e6 here. And a lot of c4 players are typically going to be like fianchettoing their bishop, and so they're kind of happy whether you go e6 or e5. Knight of 6 is a perfectly reasonable move here as well, and then white can kind of continue with their plan of like g3 and bishop g2. So this is definitely an option, knight of 6, because after g3 you could play c6 here and still get your Slav defense, right? Like bishop g2, d5. This is very similar to like a regular Slav. So this is definitely an option, and I'm sure a lot of players play this one. Let's see what else we have here. Now, this is what I would say is like kind of the closest, because in general, my feeling is like whatever you play against d4, you should try to play like a similar structure against c4. Otherwise, it's going to feel like a lot to learn. That's one of the nice things about playing the King's Indian, is that you can play it against pretty much anything. But yeah, not everyone is a King's Indian player. So if you're playing like Queen's Gambit declined, my recommendation would be like try to play like e6, d5 here. And if you're playing Nimzo, then like knight of 6, e6, and some kind of b6 somewhere. That seems to make sense, or with d5. And then yeah, Slav players I think should start with c6 or with knight of 6 and then c6. Now, the one move order where you can get kind of in trouble here with knight of 6 is if white plays knight c3. Because if you continue with c6 at this point, like trying to play d5 and recapturing with the pawn, white can just take the center with e4, and this isn't so great for black. Like you can play d5, but then you're going to get hit with a quick e5, and that's most players that go this way, they end up playing e5 here. And we're playing this kind of weird structure where we don't have a lot of space. I think this is called like a old Indian type of position, and it's not that great. Well, it works for some players, but we're going to be lacking a lot of space here. It's like a King's Indian, but you don't even get that much counterplay on the king side. You just get less space, and it's a solid position. It's not easy for white to crack, but I think this not really what most players are looking for out of the opening. So on knight c3, what many players do is they play e5 in this position, and I think it's just considered a little bit better that you forced white to commit to knight c3 compared to this position where white can play g3, bishop to g2, and then they can save this one for later. It's not like a huge difference as far as I understand, but the point is that by committing the knight to c3, when you play this kind of move with bishop to b4, the fact that we haven't played knight c6 yet, I think is a nice difference for black, because if white plays knight to d5, we can trade this one, and then the knight is not getting hit on c6. Whereas, this is getting into like a move order clinic. Let's say we just played e5 right away, and white plays g3, knight f6, bishop g2. Here, bishop b4 doesn't really make a lot of sense. You're just going to get hit with a3. So black usually starts with knight c6 here. Then after knight c3, bishop b4, white has this move, knight d5. And then takes, our knight is hit. This costs us a tempo. And so this is considered slightly worse. So I think it's a little bit better move order to start with knight f6 here. And then if they play knight c3, then you kind of play this line with e5, bishop b4, which I think is a very solid line for black. If white allows you to take on c3, then you go ahead and do it. And I think this is a very interesting structure to play. Like we weaken white's pawns, we can go rook e8, knight c6, d6. And it's kind of like a very imbalanced middle game, but I would say black has very reasonable chances here because, yeah, white structure is weak long run, and it's not that easy to use the two bishops here from white's point of view. So I think that black is very solid in these kinds of positions. But yeah, so that's one option. But honestly, what I would say is just play c6. Like, okay, you have to learn an extra line with e4, but I don't think this is like really such a big deal. If we're worried about the pawn of attack with d4, I think black has a lot of good options here. Maybe you can ask Rosenberg actually, if he does another like Caro stream, what he would recommend against the Panov. But as far as I know, like after knight f6, knight c3, black has a lot of moves here. You have e6, you have knight c6, you have g6, you have a lot of different options. You can find one that works for you and still feel like either you're going into this position, which you find comfortable with, or you can, or white will play some kind of normal Slav position, and then you can play these as well. So yeah, I don't think this one is too scary. And yeah, white can also take this way and take twice, but I think these positions are also supposed to be fine for black. Oh, Coco is saying that Rosenberg recommends g6. Yeah, that makes sense. That's one of the solid lines in the Panov. So yeah, and that's why a lot of players, they kind of play a combo of Slav and Caro-Kann. It's because a lot of times these openings will even transpose into each other and you get very similar structures. So even if you start with one opening or the other, it's like you always feel comfortable regardless of what structure you come out of in the opening. Now, is there a lot of theory in the Panov? Yeah, there is, but honestly, there's a lot of theory everywhere, and you know, it's not like it's being played every game. Like at the top levels, they're mainly not playing the Panov anymore, and I think that's because they believe in like the advanced variation, or they believe in other lines. So yeah, if it was actually that dangerous, I think we would see it like all the time, but we see a lot of grandmasters don't really go into it anymore. So yeah, I think the amount of theory honestly just is more based on the level of the players. Like if you take two high level players, then there's going to be a lot of theory in whatever opening they play because they both studied a lot. If you take two lower level players, I don't think either one is going to know that much theory regardless. Okay, so yeah, ZWeb, hopefully that is helpful. Let me go to the next question here. Next one's from Casper. All right, and Casper is asking, can you explain why the white light squared bishop goes to e2 in King's Indian, but to d3 in the Old Indian? Okay, then he gives the line. So let's put that on the board. So we're going to be starting with d4. And so the Old Indian, yeah, I actually just mentioned it in this other question. So when black plays this kind of setup, and okay, here he goes d5. Personally, actually, in this position, I would probably keep the central tension a little bit longer with knight f3, because I think if black takes on d4, I think this is a pretty comfortable structure for white. So I don't think white should really be avoiding this one. It's very similar to like a King's Indian. You can often get these kinds of structures in the King's Indian, and it's similar to like Marazzi bind if you guys are familiar with like accelerated dragon. But yeah, in general, I feel like white has a very pleasant time here. And if you're a d4 player, I think you should be kind of comfortable handling the space advantage. Generally, white is playing like f3 and maybe b3, queen d2, bringing the rooks to the center and just trying to like slowly milk the extra space. So I don't think we should be afraid of these positions. And then once black maybe makes some moves, like for example, a lot of players will do this kind of thing, and then maybe at this point it makes more sense to play d5 once black has like committed a lot of moves. And now we get like a kind of King's Indian structure where if black wants to play for this like g6 f5 plan, then they have to spend an extra tempo bringing the rook back to f8, which is, you know, not really ideal. So I kind of like delaying d5 until black does something committal and then playing d5 at a moment where, you know, you feel comfortable going into like the King's Indian structure. But you don't really have to play d5. You can play like rook e1 here, bishop f1, b3, h3. White has a lot of non-committal moves you can make before playing d5. Is d takes e5 a good solid option to try and go into the endgame? Actually, I would say no. I would say d takes e5 is a move that you want to be very careful about making here, because when we play de5, we basically let black equalize the structure in terms of space. Like we traded our space-grabbing d4 pawn for black's d6 pawn, and what we've done is we've given up some squares to black's pieces. So now black can play like c6 at some point and control the d5 square, Whereas one day in the long run, black's knight is going to end up on d4, and that could be pretty annoying, or like bishop c5, for example. So yeah, I would say d5 is not a move we want to make unless like we're getting something very concrete, like there's some kind of concrete reason. And maybe black can play knight takes as well, but if this is the case, I think in the endgame, black would be basically totally fine. c6, bishop comes out, and black has no weaknesses. But from white's point of view, I would say don't go into the endgame. Play knight d4 and then keep the space advantage. And then bishop e3, f3, I think white is comfortable. If bishop e6, you can just go, oops, b3 here. So, yeah, the question is, though, from Patreon, can you explain why the bishop goes to e2 versus to d3? And yeah, I think the main reason, let's put a classic King's Indian on the board. In this position, if you play bishop d3 as white, so the main move is to go bishop e2. But if we go bishop d3, then black can play bishop g4. And I would say this is actually pretty annoying because black wants to either take on f3 or go knight c6 and put a lot of pressure on the d4 square. And white doesn't really have a great way to deal with all this. Like let's say bishop e3, for example, black plays knight c6, and then black just wants to play e5, and we really just want to play bishop e2 here as white to neutralize the pin. So this one is kind of annoying. Let's say like h3, for example, takes. Either black can go like e5 and knight d4, or I think black gets a really nice play with this knight on d4, or in a lot of cases, knight d7 is a good move. And then again, it's like awkward to defend the d4 pawn. You have to do something like knight e2. And then anyway, black can play e5 here. And yeah, I feel like these positions are quite awkward for white. Black's pieces are just really well coordinated. So that's why in the classical King's Indian, bishop e2 is kind of the main move by an overwhelming margin. Because now in bishop g4, bishop e3, white can just defend the center a lot more comfortably. Let's say knight c6, for example. There was a recent game here, Watasha Caruana, where Caruana came up with like a really interesting new idea and won a good game. But in general, I would say white is supposed to be kind of better in these positions because the queen stays on d1 and controls the d4 square, and so black doesn't get the same pressure. And so white's bishop here is better than the queen on f3. Okay, so that's the classical King's Indian. In the old Indian, this is not really a big deal. So the line that Casper gives is just we commit to early d5, and then, yeah, a lot of players will put the bishop on d3, though I would say this is not necessarily the only way to play these positions. You can 100% play knight f3 and bishop e2, and I think there's lots of really solid setups here. So the difference is that in the old Indian, you kind of have more options. So you can go bishop d3 here, but usually I think this one is connected with the follow-up of knight ge2, because kind of the idea behind bishop d3 is to leave this e2 square open, and then white plays for this kind of setup, like bishop e3, queen d2, f3, and then even castling queenside. But yeah, we have this extra option because here there's no bishop g4, right? So it's definitely not a problem for white. But yeah, I would say a lot of times bishop d3 is connected with a quick knight e2, whereas if you're just playing the knight on f3, then I think the bishop can go to either square, but bishop e2 makes a lot of sense here because, like, for example, the knight is going to move off of f3 at one point, like knight d2 or knight e1. You can put the knight on d3, and the bishop is very useful controlling these squares, and the knight on d3 can one day support future c4, c5 break. So this is kind of a little bit convoluted with all the arrows, but let me just make some moves here. I don't know, a6. And yeah, a very typical plan is to put the knight on d3, maybe bishop on e3, rook c1, you play c5, and white plays on the queen side. And then this bishop on e2 very nicely covers the g4 and h5 squares. So in general, I do like the bishop on e2 in these positions, kind of regardless of whether black plays King's Indian or Old Indian. Okay, so hopefully, Casper, that answers that. Let's go to the next question. All right, so next one is from Dean, and Dean is asking, I learned the Alap and Sicilian as a beginner. Since I heard there's too much theory to learn, now as an intermediate player, I have some FOMO, fear of missing out, since open Sicilian games seem so dynamic and exciting. What are your thoughts on how to approach learning to play against 1c5 as white? Are the Rossolimo and Grand Prix also cop-outs to the real Sicilian action? Yeah, Dean, what can I say? First of all, thank you. Thank you for this question. Honestly, like a dream question of mine. I love it when people ask this question because I feel like I can deliver the cold-blooded truth. So the truth, in my opinion, this is all just my opinion, is that like everyone is worried about the theory nowadays. So there are people that aren't playing the open Sicilian because it's too much theory, and then there's just as many people who don't even play the Sicilian because they think it's too much theory. And the truth is that everyone thinks that everyone else like knows all the theory and is going to crush them all the time. And this is just like such an overblown fear. I feel like it's really overblown. Yeah, at the top levels, when one player really knows a lot more than their opponent, that's like a big advantage because both players at the 28, 27, 2600 level, they're so strong that if they even get like a small advantage out of the opening, they feel really good and they feel like they can use that to put pressure and convert it. But if they like know something really deeply, or if they manage to trick their opponent or catch them in some like actual like sharp preparation where like the position is just like a minefield for one side and like one wrong move means you lose. Like, yeah, that's a big deal at the top level, especially if they have some new idea and they pose some problems. That's how they often win games because something bad happens in the opening. Take Dominguez's recent game against MVL in the Sinkfield Cup. Really brilliant game, but he had a ton of pressure against MVL out of the opening because I think he knew the line like slightly deeper. MVL ran into some problems, made like one mistake, second mistake, and then it was like all over. But that's like the elite level, and this kind of stuff really doesn't happen at lower levels. Like sometimes people fall into like traps, but this isn't like the same thing. Like, so when people say like, oh, there's too much theory, this is a concern for like top players and like really strong grandmasters. And it's like, okay, even at, let's say, master level, if you play like really sharp openings, you're going to run into well-prepared players and they're going to know exactly what to do. And that's definitely not exactly a recipe for success. But the thing is like, there's going to be theory in every opening. Every opening has theory. And I made this point earlier, but it's like the amount of theory that you have to know really just depends on your level. So I actually don't know what level Dean is at, but if we're at like a low rating, like online, like you really don't have to know much at all. Even if we're up to like 2000, I think, honestly, you don't have to know a ton. People are just going to be making natural moves in the opening, and the game is going to be decided mostly by who understands the middle game better. So my recommendation, whenever I get this question, is like, try to study the middle games. Because people use this logic. They're like, oh, I'm going to get an opening every single game, so I should study the opening. And that kind of makes sense. But like, you don't know what line you're going to get. But based on the opening that you play, you do know what kind of middle game you're going to get approximately, right? So if you're playing the Sicilian, you know you're going to get a Sicilian middle game. So you're going to get a Sicilian middle game each time. My recommendation would be to study that structure, how to play Sicilian type of positions. Or if you know you're going to be getting a Grunfeld each time, or a Rui Lopez each time, or a Caro-Kann each time, I think it follows like just study the Caro-Kann middle games, the Rui Lopez middle games, the King's Indian middle games, right? You're going to be getting one of those structures every game, but it's going to be almost impossible to predict like which line you're going to get. So studying these individual lines, I think it's like, it's so, it's really, I think, inefficient. Because like one game out of 100, maybe you'll get like, the line you studied. More importantly is to like get a middle game position that you want. So my advice here for Dean and everyone else struggling with this kind of thoughts, because I know this happens to a lot of players, focus on the middle game positions that you want to play. Let me put the Sicilian on the board. So you have to ask yourself here, do you want to play the positions with opposite sides castling and both sides are attacking, very open positions? And I'm not saying you have to play those. It's like teach their own. Like if you want to play those types of positions, play the open Sicilian. Like, and as you get more games in, you'll get experience. you'll start picking up some of the theory, but more importantly, you'll learn the ideas and you'll know how to play these kinds of positions regardless of whatever line you get in the opening. And then as you play more and more games, you'll learn some of the lines and you'll learn some of the tricks. And so, okay, you lose some games online, but like, who cares? Like, you'll get those points back once you become like a more universal player. Or maybe you don't want the really sharp stuff. Personally, I'm like more of a positional technical player. I wrote a whole book on the open Sicilian. I find the positions fascinating, but for me personally, like when I play, I'm not sure if I love open positions all that much. So personally, I enjoy closed positions. I like kind of more fixed structures. And so if you want to play different types of structures, then the Alapin is a good choice. And the Rossolimo, like I mentioned, is also, or like was mentioned in the question, is also a very decent choice here. So these moves aren't cop-outs, but they are if you're like doing it for the wrong reasons, right? Because there's going to be theory all over the place. And I guarantee you this opening has a lot of theory. You know, if you play it against a much higher rated player, they're going to know it better than you. They're still going to get like some kind of advantage out of the opening where they just know it a little bit deeper. So you're never going to be avoiding theory, right? If you want to avoid theory, you know, play b4 on move 1, play b3 on move 1. And even there's going to be like a lot of theory to study. So the point is there's theory everywhere. What you really want to be doing is finding the middle games you want to play, studying those middle games, becoming like a beast at playing certain kinds of positions. And then it'll be so much easier to choose your openings because you already know, like, I want to play this kind of middle game or I want to get this kind of position out of the opening. And it'll be so much easier to choose lines because you'll know exactly what you're kind of aiming for. I think too many people, they treat the opening like, oh, if I just memorize the moves, I'll get a good position. That's just not how it works. Even if you memorize a bunch of stuff and you get some computer advantage, if you don't know how to play the resulting position, like, you're just going to be busted. Which is one of the reasons I love the King's Indian so much, because I realize like people are preparing this stuff with the engine. The engine doesn't really help all that much in those super close positions. Like, as soon as you leave your theory, you know, you have to think on your own. It's very difficult to deal with like the King's Indian counterplay. So I think it's just all about finding the middle games that you yourself enjoy, and then the theory and everything else will come from that. So if you like playing the structures you get out of the C3 Sicilian, a lot of times here after d5, you know, you're left with an isolated queen pawn. Not everyone likes that. Some players feel really good about those positions. If you're fine with that, I think it's totally worth playing. Or these positions where you get the pawn on e5, and you get a lot of space here, but okay, your pawn on e5 is going to be a weakness one day. If you're happy with these kinds of positions, by all means, you know, they're very, very playable until, you know, basically any level. It's just, I think you have to be very clear about what you want, and then don't worry about the theory either way. So, yeah, from Dean's question, it sounds like, you know, you want the dynamic and exciting action. Then definitely, yeah, the open Sicilian is the way to go. Jump in head first, the sooner the better. No one's going to know all that much anyway. You might get caught in like some quick opening traps, but what are you going to do, right? You just got to analyze your games, try not to get caught in the same thing more than once. And, you know, eventually you'll kind of get a handle on all the tricky ideas that Black has. But ultimately, it just comes down to what kind of positions you want to play. Okay, guys, rant over. Oh, wow, we're down to 0 viewers. That's unfortunate. I'm just kidding. Let's go to the next question. Hopefully that helps Dean. It's all playable. It's just a matter of what kind of middle games you want to play. And don't worry about the theory. Everyone else is just as worried as you are. All right, next question comes from Kirk. Kirk is asking, I play e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight d7, f4 against the black lion. Okay, let's put it on the board. So e4 and d6. So f4 against the black lion. Yeah, I actually played this once. I think it's a good line. Let's see what the question says. But how to continue? Should one play for a setup with knight f3, queen f3, and what is the plan in the center? Keep the tension or take with either d or f pawn? Yeah, good question. So usually when we play like this, Black's idea is to strike back in the center with e5. Otherwise, I think you would go knight f3 and we crush with e5. It's just taking too much space with white. You have both the d and the f pawn. This advance, I think, is really strong. So black is pretty much obliged to play e5. Usually white plays knight f3 here. And at this point, I think that generally black does have to take on d4. So I looked into this a little bit. If black doesn't take on d4 here, problem is you're threatening to take on e5. So let's say if bishop e7, for example, we just take on e5 twice. And if black goes knight g4, we can play bishop f4, and we're just holding on to the pawn, and I don't think black is enough here. You're ready to play h3 at some point, and the knight on g4 is just going to have nowhere to go. So I don't think this is really playable for black. I also checked this move, c6, which I think is a little bit trickier. But here again, white can take, knight g4. So this one's a little tricky because if bishop f4, there's bishop c5 here, queen d2, queen e7. Compared to the previous line, black has c6 in the position, so there's no knight d5. Here I think black is actually kind of okay if they can take this e5 pawn, which seems like they can. I don't really know how white stopped this. So against c6, what players do is in this position after knight g4, when black is trying to like win this pawn back, white is relying on this kind of counter sacrifice e6, which is a very thematic idea, a good one to know when like your opponent has sacrificed this e5 pawn and it looks like they're going to be winning it back or at least getting some counterplay. Giving it back in this fashion is kind of a nice idea. And this comes up in different positions, not just this one, because then you give the pawn back, but you then play against black's weaknesses, because now this e6 pawn is weak, f7 is weaker. So for example, like knight g5 here is a good move, and I think black is in a little bit of trouble. There have been some games like knight d5, we trade queens, h3 for example, this knight has to go back, bishop f4, and white is just having a lot of pressure here. Castle's queenside, bishop is really strong, knight f7 is hanging, bishop c4 is coming in. Yeah, I think this position is just very, very nice for white. So this one is not really working out for black, which is why in this position after f4, e5, knight f3, black is usually taking on d4 here. And then after e takes d4, I think a lot of players take with the knight, but it feels like the main line is to take with the queen. And here white is actually threatening like immediate e5, which is pretty scary. So black's main move is to go c6, and what black is doing here is they're preparing to actually play d5, kind of sacrifice this pawn. Although as far as I understand, I don't think white is usually accepting the sacrifice. So bishop e3 here is the usual continuation, then black tries for d5, and what white should do is just advance e5 and take this space. And if bishop c5, then queen to d2, and we're getting kind of like a French type of position, but I think white is generally doing pretty well. Like your pawns on f4 and e5 are pretty strong. The idea is to castle queenside and put the king on b1 at some point. And yeah, I think white is doing pretty well. I saw a game by Simon Williams, a blitz game, but still useful, where he played knight to g4. White played bishop g1, bishop c5. And I mean, this is the this is the Black Lion King himself. Actually, Simon played knight h6 in this position. And then after white castled here, knight f5 was played, queen d2, h5. And here white played the move king b1, which I think was a normal move. White was better. But apparently he could have sacked on d5, which I thought was a very cool idea. And then queen takes d5, and white just has like a crushing position, like bishop c4 coming, e6, knight g5. Like black's king is just stuck in the center, and white's pieces are coming out very, very quickly. So this was kind of a fun opportunity white could have played here. So yeah, I don't think you have to like memorize all that. I'm just trying to show some typical ideas. But basically, if black doesn't go for these sharp lines with like d5, e5, it's pretty tough because white is just trying to crush in the center with e5 themselves. So yeah, that's my recommendation. Play knight f3, take on d4 with the queen, and then you're playing for e5 if they go c6. I think here e5 is not as clear because they get their bishop to c5, and again the queen comes to e7, and we don't have any kind of possible knight d5 ideas. So I think this one is not as good for white. So here white usually goes e3, and then we're trying to castle queenside here. And it's very much like an open Sicilian type of position because black is often going to castle kingside. But I think white should be better here. You have a lot of space. Bishop is often developed to c4, and I think white's chances here are pretty reasonable. At least we have the nice space advantage. Okay, Kirk, hopefully that is helpful for you. Let's go to the next one. Actually, I wanted to mention one game here after e5, knight g4, bishop g1, bishop c5, queen d2. This is a game where black traded bishops on g1, played queen b6. And this is a game between Karyakin and Nepomniachtchi back from 2012, but both players were already like 2,700, so pretty decent. And after queen b6, we ended up getting this endgame with knight a4, queen e3, takes, bishop d3. And I think white was just clearly better here. The knight can come back to the center very quickly. The king is good either on e2, or one day white can castle queenside or castle by hand. And I really like just white's kind of pawns in the center. Black has to figure out the light squared bishop. So it's a nice advantage here for white. And that's a game you can check out, Karyakin Nepo from 2012. Okay, let's go to the next question. Next one from Ricker. All right, Ricker says, I have general questions. Under 1800 level, how many moves in the opening are generally theory? Everyone knows more or less. Yeah, good question. Not much, I think. Not much. I play Queen's Gambit and Rui, and I want to know about the transition from the opening to the beginning of the middle game. That is a crucial place in the game. Sometimes everything looks so balanced, I honestly don't know what to do next. I try to be patient, play waiting move, and hope the opponent stumbles or wait for an opportunity. What is the best strategy at that place in the game? Yeah, tough questions, Ricker. I mean, Queen's Gambit, Rui, these are some of the most solid openings out there, but I hope I can offer something useful. Now, let's just put a position on the board. Let's put like a classic Rui. So something like this, we typically get where white goes like rook e1, b5, bishop b3, d6. I mean, there's different lines there, Marshall and all these positions, but it's more of a general question. So let's tackle the general question first. Under 1800 level, how many moves in the opening are generally theory that everyone knows more or less? Yeah, I mean, really depends on the opening. My estimate in terms of like the specific move number, I would say the average is like maybe between, okay, under 1800 is a wide bracket, but let's say 1400 to 1800, like kind of that top chunk, I'd say probably between 5 to 10 is kind of like a wide estimate, but somewhere in there I would imagine would be like the average. Under 1400, I think the average might be less. Some players, like, they don't know any theory past like move 4 or 5, like depending on the opening. Like you can't even call it theory. They just know like the first 3-4 moves that they play, and then they figure it out, right? Other players, they kind of know like maybe the main line. They know like 8-10 moves, but if you play like a sideline, like they're already on their own, right? Like there are some Sicilian players that know the open Sicilian really well because they're like worried about the theory. But then, yeah, if you play like c3 or something or knight c3, they're like already on their own, like wondering what to do. So it really just depends, I think, on the player and the opening. But I think it's rare that you get people that know theory past move 10. Let's say I think that's pretty rare. Okay. So then Ricker was also asking about the transition from the opening to the middle game. So yeah, this I think is a more interesting question to think about, and a very, very critical one, because I mean, this is like the essence of how to play middle games. Like how do you play the middle game, right? Like how do you play chess? In general, when you are entering the middle game, or you're going from like the late opening phase, early middle game, rooks are usually like not connected and you have to figure out how to complete your development. You need some kind of plan, right? You need to complete your development and think about your kind of long-term plan in the opening. So like in these classic Rui positions where white goes like c3, h3 to stop bishop g4, and we get something like this. Here, like white's long-term plan is you're trying to play on the king side. So you're putting the knight on f1. Sometimes white is playing g4, sometimes knight g3 without g4. Generally, the knight is going to g3. And yeah, usually white is kind of looking towards the king side, though there are many games where white also plays on the queen side with moves like a4, and then bringing this bishop back to d3 to put pressure on this b5 pawn. And this is actually one of the whole points behind the Ruy Lopez. By putting this early pressure with bishop to b5, white is trying to put pressure and induce black to make this weakness, right? If black wants to stop the pressure, they have to advance their pawn to b5 here at some point to shut down the bishop, but then this is a target that white can later attack. So there's kind of two plans here for white, either trying to play on the king side or on the queen side. Now, this is like the classic Rui position. There's many different lines in the Rui. For example, in the Marshall, the play is very different here. After castle, c3, d5, much more open position. And if white doesn't take the pawn, then black equalizes comfortably. If white does take the pawn, then black gets a lot of counterplay on the king side. So this is like a completely different game. Here it's like white trying to hold on to their extra pawn, and black is the one that is attacking on the king side. So a lot of players, they don't like these kinds of middle games. So against the move order where black tries to play the Marshall, white often ends up playing something else, like a4, h3. They don't make this c3 move because they want to get into like a different kind of middle game where they haven't blocked the knight on c3. So it's really hard to give general advice without knowing about like the exact position, because the Rui, the Sicilian, all these openings, they can lead to so many different structures. But generally, what we're trying to do out of the opening is to come up with a feasible plan, completing our development, and then finding some kind of plan in the position or some kind of target. Either that means playing on the king side, improving the position there, playing on the queen side, improving the position there, and so on. Let's talk about the Queen's Gambit a little bit. So here after d4, let's say we get the classic QGD. This is a different structure that one can get. For example, bishop g5, bishop e7. There's many different setups and ways that people can play, but a lot of times this is pretty typical. Here it's very common to suggest white to put the knight on e2 so that one day you can play for a plan of like f3, e4. And so this is a different position. I would say this is like a very classic one that we get into a lot at all kinds of levels. And here white has a couple of different plans. One is to play on the queen side with the minority attack. Jesse thinks the minority attack is for chumps. He made a YouTube video about that where he analyzed the game. I actually really like the philosophy that playing this kind of position, it's about combining two different plans. So one plan is to play for like b4, b5 and trying to put a weakness for black on c6. The other plan is to play for f3, e4 and playing in the center. And I think ideally the way white should handle these positions is actually by trying to play for both plans and choosing one based on the moves that black makes, because black is going to play on one side of the board as well, and one plan might be more achievable than the other. But both of these plans, a little bit slower, and in these types of positions, white is trying to take space. So Ricker, when you're trying to figure out like what to do in a position, I think you have to choose one kind of general approach. Either you're playing on the king side, putting your pieces closer to the enemy king, looking for something to attack, or maybe you're putting pressure on a target, or maybe you're just gaining space. But I think you want to choose one of these kinds of domains and then figure out exactly what you want to do in the position. One of the most typical plans I would say is just choosing a target and then trying to apply pressure on it, whether it's by advancing a pawn and playing for some pawn break or improving your pieces and putting pressure on that target. I think this is one of the most typical plans in many positions at the beginning of the middle game. So it's kind of like these three general approaches: attacking the king, attacking a specific positional weakness like a weak pawn or weak square, or just generally gaining space. The third one being pretty uncommon, but does happen in quite a number of closed structures. Okay. So yeah, I would say in general, try to find a way to improve your position, but obviously we're always calculating on every move or staying concrete. The opponent makes some moves that look loose or like they're opening the position. If the game gets tactical, then you have to turn on your tactical side and start calculating variations. I take this guy, he takes here, I take here, and have to sort through the mess. But if the position stays closed and not much is going on, then we're choosing a target, improving our position, taking space, and so on. And this is where studying annotated games is very useful. If you study games in specific structures, I think this is one of the best ways to improve your understanding of those kinds of positions. Very simply, just studying how strong players approach them, right? Like, if you want to know how to play like the Ruy Lopez really well, why not study the games of Magnus and Caruana and Kasparov and Karpov and Fischer and like all these great players that have handled these exact same positions, these exact same structures. Why not try to learn from how they handled the positions? I think that's one of the best ways to improve your own middle game understanding. All right, Ricker, hopefully that helps. Thanks for the question. I think it was a really good one, hopefully useful for others as well. Let's go to the next one. Next one is from Laurent. And Laurent is asking, do you think 1d4, d6, knight f3, f5, knight c3 is an okay try? All right, let's take a look. d4, d6, knight f3, f5. So kind of a weird move order for the Dutch. But some players do play this one. So here he wants to play knight c3. So I don't want to play the mainline Dutch. So if black were to play f5 here, Laurent would go knight c3. And so after 3 knight c3, so if black starts with this weird d6 move order, knight f3, f5, knight c3, should I aim for a quick e4 or a slow setup with bishop f4, bishop g5, and then e3? Yeah, so I looked into this one a little bit, and I feel like here white should play for developing the bishop, and then it seems like what often happens after knight f6, bishop g5, if black plays like knight bd7, for example, like trying to avoid the double pawns, then what white typically goes for is queen d3, attacking the pawn, preparing to castle queenside, and then, yeah, playing for e4 and opening the center. So I looked at this a little bit, and yeah, it looked pretty good for white. E4 takes, and then white is ready to castle queenside and play like h4. And yeah, it looks like white has very reasonable play. At some point, the queen might get out of the way, and the bishop can come into like d3 or c4, kind of depending. But yeah, it looks very fun for white. Like it's kind of like a mirrored open Sicilian, right? And the Sicilian would go e4, c5, knight f3, and d4. Here it's like d4, f5, knight c3, and e4. So it's kind of like an open Sicilian, but it's black's king that's going to be more open, right? Black played f5, and so their king side is always going to be vulnerable to like an h4, h5 push. So these positions just look really fun for white. And if queen d3, e6, I think same thing, just e4, takes, and yeah, this just looks really, really nice for white. So yeah, I don't know if black doesn't play knight d7, if they go g6, here it seems like what white is happy to do is just take on f6, double the pawns, and then play against this kind of weakened structure. One interesting move here is d5 I saw, just like fixing all the light squares in the position and then planning to put the knight on d4, and then the bishop can hop in either like bishop c4, or you can play like knight d4, g3, bishop g2, and then I think white has a really nice harmonious setup on the light squares. And then one day, of course, h4, h5 is going to be pretty annoying for black. So yeah, I think this is overall pretty pleasant for white. I don't think these lines are generally that good. And if black doesn't play knight f6, like if they play g6 here, then I think you can just go ahead and play e4. And again, it's kind of like an open Sicilian. It's very funny, but yeah, you play like bishop d3, h4, h5, get the bishop out, queen e2, castle queenside, and yeah, I think white just has a very healthy initiative here. Okay, so yeah, hopefully that helps, Laurent, to answer your question. Yeah, play for e4 for sure. All right, let's go to the next question. I think we have two more. The next one is from Dan Schmidt. And all right, Dan is asking, I enjoy most lines of the open Spanish as black, but I have trouble creating interesting chances for my bishop pair after 6 rook e1, which is pretty popular below master level. Any tips? Yeah, let's put the open Spanish on the board. So e4, we have e5. Here we have the Ruy Lopez. And then the open Spanish is when, in this position after castles, black plays knight takes e4. Now, some players will play d3 here as white to kind of avoid this opening, but the drawback of playing d3 early is that basically you kind of forfeit your right to play c3, d4 in one move in other lines. So I think it's considered at least a slightly more passive approach, but yeah, some players do this as white. But the question is really from black's point of view. So question is, after knight takes e4, main line here is for white to play d4 and try to open the center, and there's some complications, but some players apparently go rook e1, knight c5, they take on c6, they win their pawn back, and then black goes bishop e7, d4, knight e6, and we get this kind of position. And yeah, I kind of get Dan's problem here, because it's like, it does feel a little bit passive from black's point of view, and that's compensated with the bishop pair, but then you have to use the bishop pair. Yesterday, Samai Reina called it the bishop pair disadvantage because most players, they work really hard trying to keep the bishops, and then it ends up hurting their position. So yeah, question is how to create interesting chances for the bishop pair in this kind of position. So I don't have like such a great answer for this one. I'm not like super experienced in these kinds of positions. I used to play the Ruy Lopez a little bit, and I got some like similar stuff out of like the Exchange Ruy. And in general, yeah, I always liked having the light squared bishop because when this piece is unopposed, it's just a very strong piece in the position. And if the light squared bishop ever opens up, then white is just doing really, really well. I understand that the plan here, let's say white makes some normal moves, is to play castles, rook e8, and play for f6 to one day kick this knight off of e5. And then the bishop will one day kind of cover these light squares because the knight can drop back to f8. But let's talk a little bit about like how to handle this problem, because I think it's a pretty typical one where it's like you're just trying to figure out how to improve your understanding of the position. What I usually do, and I know Dan is somewhere in like the expert range. I think Dan's rating. Dan, if you're in the chat, you can correct me, but I think Dan is somewhere around like 2,000 or 2,100 OTB rating. And yeah, at this level, I think the main way to kind of strengthen your understanding is by studying high-level games. So USCF 2000. Yeah, so when you sent me this question, and I like don't really know a whole lot about this position, first thing I did was I opened up the database and I just started looking at some games. So one game I found that I thought was, high level was this, again, online blitz game from Lichess between Grischuk and Aparin. And okay, two like really high level players. I turned on the engine to kind of like follow their play. And like they played like a pretty decent game. And, I just started kind of analyzing a little bit. So Grischuk played c4 here, which seems like a very reasonable move. Black played rook e8, knight c3. f6 was played, knight went back to f3. And now black played knight f8, h3, I'm guessing to stop bishop g4, bishop e6. So this was kind of Oparin's approach. Puts the bishop on e6, attacks the c4 pawn. And here Grischuk played d5, which after c takes d5, the engine really didn't like, but we'll come back to that. Because I was thinking like, well, all right, what happens if not d5, right? What happens if white just plays b3, just sticks with the plan? This is the move I would expect in like online blitz normally, right? Just b3, defending the pawn, straightforward. Then the engine just gives this move bishop f7, very flexible. The bishop can come to g6 if you need, or the knight can come back to e6. And then it seemed like black was like trying to improve the position, like queen d7, rook a d8. And like, okay, you just analyze a little bit, and I think slowly you get kind of like a feeling for what you're trying to do. I would recommend even analyzing deeper and just seeing what are some of black's next couple of moves. Great way to analyze, by the way, like you're not sure what to do in the position as black. You take the white side against Stockfish 14, play some natural moves, or moves that you would be kind of worried about, let it outplay you, and then you kind of get a feeling for like, oh yeah, these positions aren't that easy for white either, right? Usually that's kind of what happens, one way or the other. Like, or let's say, you're looking at a position from white's point of view, and it's like you don't know what to do there. You're supposed to be better, but you're like not sure how exactly. Then you take the black side, you let Stockfish crush you a couple, practice games, and you start to understand like what the issues are. So in the game, Grischuk played d5, and then black took, and then he played c takes d5. And apparently this was actually a big mistake because, for whatever reason, Stockfish prefers knight takes d5, but optically, like, yeah, I can kind of understand why he didn't want to do this one. Actually, I'm not sure I know Grischuk's reasoning, but it does feel like a somewhat loose move because his pawn on c4 is always going to be a target. Maybe he thought this was equal and he wanted to be more ambitious. I'm not really sure. But in any case, after bishop f7, knight h4 was the continuation. Black played bishop b4, rook to c1. And then for whatever reason, black played knight g6 here. He could have actually taken on c3 and then taken on d5 and actually just won this pawn. So I don't know, it was a blitz game. I don't know what the players are calculating. I'm not going to judge too harshly. The point is just that it's interesting to analyze these games and then you see certain opportunities. So here, like, black could have just been like a healthy pawn up, and okay, hopefully we're happy to play this position as black right after 20 moves. And so this is kind of the approach. Just you take one game that looks like it was played at a reasonably high level, even if it's like a blitz game, but it's between two like 2,700 monsters. I think usually those games are going to be pretty instructive anyway. And you just analyze a little bit. You ask questions. Why did they make this move? Why didn't they play this move? And slowly you might get a feeling for the position. The other technique I mentioned, playing against the engine, I think is really useful. When you don't feel comfortable in a position, just let the engine beat you over and over, and then you'll slowly start to understand what are some of the typical ideas. And yeah, then if it's really causing you problems, then maybe it means you should play the line from white's point of view. If it can be part of your repertoire, maybe it's just like a good line, right? You can play it from white's perspective and score some nice wins. And if not, then it means black must have some counter chances. But yeah, hopefully the general approach is kind of helpful for you, Dan, and others. When you're not sure what to do in a position, I think the best way is to find some high-level games, analyze them. Playing training games from a specific position is, of course, really useful as well. If you can find a training partner willing to take the other side. And yeah, still little by little, I think we can pick up key details. Okay, Dan, hopefully that was useful. But yeah, I like this plan. Rook e8, f6, knight f8. That seems pretty solid. All right, guys, last question from Kaglar. Kaglar asks, I play the Caro advance tall variation. So e4, c6, and then yada, yada, yada. Let's put it on the board. Queen b6, bishop d3, takes, e6, knight d2, queen a6. How should white continue here, and where should white's pieces go ideally? Yeah, this one I had to look up as well. I'm not like, big e4 expert or Caro expert, but I looked at some lines from this position, or I looked at some games, I should say. In general, against queen a6, white is playing c4 and avoiding the queen trade. As far as I understand, black doesn't really want to take here too quickly because then white will put a knight on c4 and a knight on e4, and black is going to have big problems on the d6 square. So yeah, white gives up the d5 square, but if you get your knights to e4, you get a knight to d6, it's really a big problem for black. So usually black is not taking on c4 here and just keeping the pawn on d5. And then white's idea is to play a quick b3 and secure c4 so that if black ever takes, white can take back with the pawn and then control this d5 square and control a bunch of space. So there was one game here played by Gawain Jones. Again, online blitz, very instructive game, where I think he kind of shows like the model setup for white. So bishop b4 was played, very natural move. He goes b3, knight e7, and this is usually what black does. They put the knight on e7, they put the knight on f5. Here he goes knight e2, which I think is very important. The other move is like you could play knight f3 in this position, but We'll see why he goes knight e2. Black plays knight f5. White castles, knight d7. And here, Jones played knight g3. So this is the game Jones against Shi, S-H-I, chess.com Internet 2020. So I think it was like some title Tuesday. And after knight g3, he's putting a lot of pressure on f5. I don't think Black really wants to play g6 here because that's very weakening on the light squares. But okay, it would be worth analyzing this move as well. In the game, after Black took on g3, White played fg and then gets a very nice open f file. So this is really apparently very dangerous structure for Black. In the game, Black played bishop e7, and then already after rook takes f7, White was crushing. So I don't know if he knew this or he just like calculated at the board because he's super quick. But yeah, this was just killing. Like rook f1 check, and Black can give back a piece, but White still has a huge attack. Black tried king e8, queen g6, takes on e7. And here Black didn't even recapture the bishop because rook f7 and queen takes e6 would have just been way too devastating. So this rook takes f7 sack was like totally crushing. If Black did not go bishop e7 here, I think Black had to play like bishop takes d2, but still after queen takes d2, the queen is coming to like f4. And yeah, this bishop on g5 is a very, very strong piece and very annoying for Black's position. Because Black can't castle queenside, and if Black castles kingside, then the king is kind of a sitting duck there on the dark squares. And I know Cartier Tank likes attacking position, so I imagine this is going to be very, very suitable for Cartier. So yeah, this knight g3 idea, this is kind of cool. And yeah, I guess that's kind of the setup. You go c4, b3, and knight e2, knight g3, castle kingside, and White is doing pretty well. Black can go f6 in some of these positions, but it doesn't really solve their problems because they're still left with a lot of weaknesses. So if we go to this position, let's say takes, for example. Yeah, f6 here is already very tough when the rook is opened up on the f file. If we, let's say, play knight d7 here for Black instead of knight f5 and like f6 here, then I actually looked at this. I thought White had an interesting idea to take and play a3, just going after the bishop. Bishop takes d2, we can recapture with d2 ourselves. If bishop d6, then White plays bishop f4, and then the knight comes to f4, and Black has, once you play f6, the e6 pawn becomes a huge, huge target. So Black doesn't really solve their problems here either. So yeah, this looks like the way to play. So enjoy the positions from here: knight e2, castles, knight g3, and then playing on the king side. Okay, question from the chat: is it okay to let Black play queen takes b2? Yeah, I think there's a lot of theory here, where like if they take on b2 at this moment, I think White is going e6 or queen b3, and I think Cartier Tank has worked these positions out because these are like the main line. Then after e6, knight d2, I think again White gets a lot of counterplay here with the rook takes b7, and yeah, this is supposed to be quite nice for White. So, or I'm not sure how nice it is, but I think people going into this line are generally pretty happy because it's a pretty fun sacrifice for White to make. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Hopefully that answers your question, Kaglar. And yeah, actually, that's going to wrap it up for the opening lab. A lot of great questions today. I think we covered a lot of ground, guys. Study your middle games, I guess, is the big lesson of the day. Yeah, we do this show every month for some of our Patreon subscribers. Then we do the stream live so everyone can benefit from the questions, but at least the subs get to send in the questions ahead of time and get their specific positions and questions answered. I think that's going to wrap it up for the stream and the show. So thanks for tuning in. Catch you guys next time.